So in today's video, I'm going to be sharing the 5 stages of the spiritual awakening journey. But before we get started, I just want to clarify that many of us will most likely move around many times between these stages because it's not always going to be linear. For example, when we first start to wake up, we will most likely get pulled back into being in an unconscious state. So for me, especially at the beginning of my journey, there was a very strong magnetic-like or gravitational-like pull going back into unconsciousness. It was like no matter how hard I tried to be present or be aware in the moment, I would go right back into being unconscious. So there was always this struggle of trying to maintain presence and awareness. But we can also move around these stages in the other direction as well. We can experience moments of elevated states of consciousness. So in Zen Buddhism, these moments can be called satori. They're experiences of inner joy, deep sense of peace, unconditional love, and we get to experience glimpses of these higher states. It's as if the universe is dangling a carrot in front of us to incentivize us to wake up and to evolve our consciousness. So remember that the spiritual journey is a continuous practice, the key words being continuous and practice. And these stages can overlap, so it'll be normal to bounce around. And just like with life, the spiritual journey is not just black or white. So the first stage is the unawakened or unconscious stage. Here, we're mostly run by our ego, which are memorized thought patterns and behaviors that run our life. We're mostly living in a dreamlike state, living on autopilot. They're habitual ways of being that we've learned over time in how to deal with the world. And in his book, A New Earth, Eckhart Tolle talks extensively about the ego, and he defines the ego as being completely identified with form. Form can be physical, like your body or material possessions, so like the things you own. Form can also be psychological, like your thoughts or beliefs, like the voice in your head. So we mistakenly believe that these things make us who we are. We identify with them. But in actuality, that's not who we are. That is the ego, the false self. What we truly are is consciousness. So the ego is a product of our environment. Our ego is a set of programs that have been conditioned mostly during childhood and continues as we get older. We get conditioned by our parents, our family, even our teachers. We basically get conditioned by the society we grew up in. And this is why I shared my personal stories of how my ego got conditioned during childhood, to basically give some examples of how this mechanism works. So the ego is a survival mechanism, and on a spiritual level, the goal is to transcend the ego, to transcend its primitive, animalistic ways of surviving. And unfortunately, not everyone is going to be able to move beyond this stage. There will be many people who will go through most of their lives staying at the stage. So the next stage is the wake-up stage. This is where we wake up from the hypnotic rhythm of life, of that dreamlike state. I know this comparison is really cliched and overused, but I'm going to say it here anyways. But this stage is similar to the movie The Matrix, where Neo, the main character, is asked to either take the red pill or the blue pill, in which he chooses the red pill, so he wakes up from the simulated reality of the Matrix. This is Neo waking up from his dream state that he was in. And for us in this stage of the journey can be a very similar experience. It can be our aha moment. It's having the realization that there is more to life than what we've been conditioned to believe. I must have been about 13 or 14 years old when The Matrix came out. And my friend's mom took us to the theater to see it because she thought it was amazing. And I remember being so wowed by that movie, not just because of its visual effects or action scenes or anything like that, but I was in awe because of the deeper message of that movie. I don't know why, but it resonated with me so much. I couldn't understand it or articulate it at the time, but there was like a deep sense of knowing. of relating to Neo's character of waking up. So I don't know why, but maybe the movie shook me a bit because it was giving me a little glimpse, a little window into what was coming for me in the future, that I was going to wake up to my own spiritual journey. So in this wake up stage, we start to get curious and we ask ourselves deeper questions like, what is the purpose of life? What is the purpose of my life? Who am I? What am I? Why am I the way that I am? We start to become more open to spirituality. We start learning and studying about it. We start learning different types of spiritual practices. But I do need to warn you, and I'm only doing this because I've been through this myself, but don't get stuck in this stage because it can stall our spiritual growth. Although this is a very uplifting phase to be in, to be open to the possibility of feeling better, of experiencing higher states of consciousness. But if you're serious about your spiritual growth, you don't want to get stuck here and get attached to all the feel-good feelings. I was stuck here for years because I was too scared and resisted the whole idea of going into the next stage, which is the internal work stage. This is a very important part of the awakening journey. There are many different terms for this stage, but they all essentially share the same message of doing the inner work to let go of the false self, to let go of the illusion. Ken Wilber calls this shadow work. Eckhart Tolle describes it as disidentifying with the ego and the pain body. David Hawkins describes it as the process of letting go of negative emotions. And Michael Singer uses the term surrendering. And there are plenty of other terms as well. But this is where I believe the true spiritual journey begins. I believe that this is one of the most important work for our spiritual growth because it's about letting go of the false self and therefore letting our true selves emerge. In this stage, we start to differentiate between the true spiritual journey and spiritual theatrics, which can include the spiritual ego. Spiritual theatrics is when we identify with the image of being spiritual, and sometimes the ego can take it on as another role or mask to wear. But we're not doing the inner work that we need to do to let go of the ego. And I'm not one to judge because I've been there myself, and I know about having a spiritual ego and playing spiritual theatrics. So this is why this stage of doing the internal work is so important. Don't get me wrong, it's fun to learn about and be into spirituality, but it's important that we put what we learn into action. So this is where we take all the knowledge and understanding that we learned from the wake-up stage, and we do our inner work. And as we do the inner work and let go of the false self, we may experience an ego death or the dark night of the soul. This is usually, but not always, the painful experience of letting go of the ego while the ego is trying its best to hold on. And we may experience multiple ego deaths or dark nights of the soul as we shed each layer of the ego. Depending on how far along or serious we are in the journey, we may start to see that there will be periods where we will cycle between the wake-up stage and the internal work stage. Awakening and dark nights of the soul seem to go hand in hand. And it's important to note that we will experience our spiritual awakening as a gradual process, not as an instantaneous overnight experience. While that does happen for some people, for example, Eckhart Tolle and Michael Beckwith, but it's not going to be very common for most people. So in one of my videos, I shared my experience of going through a challenging period of the dark night of the soul, but what came out of that was a renewed sense of self. I guess you could call it a rebirth of sorts. And so this next stage is the reintegration stage. So this is where I'm personally just starting to get into. While we may still have an ego at this stage, it'll most likely be a lot less strong as it was before. We will be less identified with the ego because of all the internal work we've been doing. We will notice that our priorities have shifted, and sometimes it can be in a major way. This is where the world around us starts to change and starts becoming a reflection of the changes we made internally. So in this stage, we start asking ourselves, How do I want to show up in the world? How do I honor myself while at the same time function in society? How do I integrate this new state of consciousness into my life? How can I be of service? This stage is about living more consciously, more intentionally, and more deliberately. So the fifth stage is the awakened or conscious stage. David Hawkins, who wrote the book Power versus Force, introduces to us the idea of there being a map of consciousness, and that there are different levels of consciousness that we each calibrate at. He also speaks about the level of unconditional love. At this level, there is no longer an ego, so one is no longer identified with the ego. People who calibrate at this level of unconditional love or higher is actually very rare in our world. This is the realm of saints and of advanced spiritual students and healers. So people at this level make a difference in the world just by existing, by being here. The energy of unconditional love is miraculous, transformative, and selfless. So imagine what kind of world we would live in if we put in the effort to evolve our consciousness. Imagine how much of a difference we can make to those around us by being more conscious, more awake. What would you become? What would your experience be like living in a state of deep inner peace, joy, and love? So as we continue to diligently do our work, our internal work, and let go of the false self, we will eventually reach these higher states of consciousness. So remember that the spiritual path is not always going to be a straight line. You'll move forward, then back a little, and forward and back again. So it's normal to bounce around multiple times and be in different stages in the awakening process. So I wish you all the best and good luck on your journey.